Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Secrets at the BBFC podcast. My name is Tom, I'm your host, and today we are going to be examining the pros and cons of BBFC censorship. So basically the way this will work is that we'll examine 3 pro arguments and 3 con arguments. We'll intersperse those arguments with case studies of films, and then at the end we're going to be doing a bit of a Q&A session at the end. So, as always, I have a guest for the podcast, and here with me today is John, who is a film studies doctoral student from Norfolk. So, hi, John.
Hello, Tom. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you too, and very good to have you on the podcast.
You're welcome.
So, absolutely. So, without further ado, I think we should begin with our first pro argument. So, the first pro argument I chose, first pro argument I really thought of was that BBFC censorship can occasionally protect the population from possessing dangerous or illegal material, and of course we've obviously seen in the past few years a number of works receiving compulsory BBFC cuts, ranging from issues such as indecency to animal cruelty. Mainly indecency, because obviously under the Child Protection Act, possession of indecent material of a child can result in prosecution. So, John, do you want to comment on that?
So, yeah, obviously, in an ideal world, there'd be no need for rules and regulations. However, we don't live in an ideal world, and we never will do. So that's the first thing. So in society, we're always going to need some kind of limitations for the greater good. Now, it doesn't matter whether that's rules for regarding film classification or rules for driving a car on the road. There has to be limitations of some kind to a greater or lesser degree. Now, it would be lovely to have no rules at all, but whilst it is understandable that people don't like to have things like films, they don't like them. They like them intact and uncut. The fact is that there is still content out there that it is deemed too controversial, too dangerous, and potentially hugely offensive and degrading. And as anybody who knows the basis of the BBFC and some of the content it has banned and restricted over the years, even as recently as the last couple of years, you can understand why some films are still cut.
Oh, absolutely. You can. There is certainly an argument to be made for certain works receiving cuts, even in this day and age where you can basically find anything on the internet. And I think one thing that comes to my mind in particular that that was cut in the last couple of years was Sister Street Fighter, which was cut for its Blu-ray release. I think it was the second film that was cut, I believe.
Indeed, yeah.
And it was released uncut in the US, but Melon Farmers advises you not to import it from the US because you could potentially be prosecuted if you are in possession of such material. So there is certainly an argument to be made for restricting certain material that could get you in a serious amount of trouble.
And certainly, and just so your audience is aware of why that film is contentious, without going into graphic detail, there is an image of a minor in a sexual pose, which is basically child pornography. So that is why that film is cut in the UK, and why in America they said it was fine. But when I have actually seen that sequence, and there's no justification for its inclusion. It doesn't add anything to the film. It has no purpose or merit to it. So actually, if you didn't know it was there for the 4 or 5 seconds that it appears on screen, or in this case, in the UK version is cut, you're not going to lose anything from watching the film with it or without it. So I think, as I said, for the greater good, there are certain material that has to be excised for the greater good of society.
But then, and then of course, you have people countering that argument who would state that as adults they should be free to watch whatever they want to watch. But then again, as you point out, there is also the danger of possessing indecent material, and also possessing material, um, well, it just in general possessing that kind of indecent material. And another film that comes to mind, certainly in my mind, is a Serbian film, which is
Yes,
a 2010 Serbian film. It's not
indeed.
something I would ever want to watch personally, but to be honest, I have no idea what anyone else's film tastes are. But
Well,
again, without going into graphic detail, it was cut by about 4 minutes to remove a lot of child indecency.
yeah,
And of course, the BBFC, well, the BBFC did actually issue a cuts list, and I did read some of it, and some of it did seem very concerning to me personally. So
yeah. It's one of
obviously,
those films. Sorry for interrupting. It's one of those
no, no,
films where, um, if you have, I have seen Uncut. I was a member of a film group um, that was paid to do reviews, and I was sent the film about 2 months before it was due to appear at Fright Fest that year in London. So it was basically before anybody had heard of this film. I was sent it unaware because I like foreign films, I liked horrors. So the person that sent it to me, who ran the website, said, "Oh, you'll be good to review it," and they had no idea what it was either. So I remember watching it, and I remember going, "Oh my God, this is horrendous." And I thought there is no chance in hell that the BBFC were going to cut it. And I put my review online, and it is still online, and I will send you the link so that your audience can look into it later on. And then about 2 months afterwards, Westminster City Council realised that this film was showing at Fright Fest in London, in central London that year, and they wanted to see it because they got wind of the reviews, not just from me, from other people, from the internet, of the content, of the extreme nature of it. And when they realised what it was, that they insisted that the BBFC examining it before Fright Fest were going to show it. And because, as you say, the heavy amount of cuts, Fright Fest decided that they wouldn't show a cut version. They would rather pull the entire film out. And there's a huge uproar about it. But if you have seen the uncut version, and anybody out there who's listening who has seen it, frankly, you can understand why it's been cut, because the material in it is so extreme that even if you're an anti-censorship stance, and you're a horror fan, and even though it is a fictional film and clearly nobody was harmed and it is faked, there is a limit to what should be shown, I think, in a decent society. And I'm a film fan, but I think that for me, that was the film that kind of that made me realize that there has to be limits. There are certain content you go, no, this is too much, this is not acceptable anymore. And I've now become less of a film fan because I find many modern horror films, like a Serbian film, to just be filled with more and more explicit gore, more and more sexualized violence. The misogynistic treatment of women is appalling in a lot of them. And certainly if you look at some of the stuff that comes out in America now, some of the things like American Guinea Pig, which is not related except in name to the original Guinea Pig franchise, which it is basically, it's a film about a serial killer who goes around butchering women. Okay, I get that. I understand why it might be interesting to a niche part of the audience. But frankly, we've got to a stage in horror films, I think now, where just upping the gore quotient, upping the sexual violence, upping the depravity, it's no longer horrifying. It's just unrelentingly sadistic and nasty. And I think this then takes full circle to the early 80s and the video nasty era.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And and obviously there is an argument to be made for distinguishing between something that has nasty content as integral to its structure, but films that have nasty content that aren't so integral to its structure and just feel like flim flam to the film
Yeah,
almost. So I guess an example of that would be, and again I haven't seen this, but I Spit on Your Grave, which is
right.
a revenge film, and I believe that it consists. I think the latter half of it consists of a sequence where a woman basically exacts revenge on the men who assaulted her,
Yeah.
and it feels like well, some people would argue that that the film shouldn't be cut because the rape sequences at the beginning arguably justify the need for her to exact revenge on her perpetrators. So what do you think of that argument?
It's quite difficult. I mean, I have seen I Spit on Your Grave, the original, the 1978 version we're talking about here.
Yeah.
The Miyazaki, I think his name is, the director. It's one of those films where what many people don't know is the director based it on a real story. It's he actually, him and I believe it's his teenage daughter at the time, came across a woman when they were out in somewhere local to where they were filming at the time, prior to making this film. And they came across a woman who had been sexually assaulted, had been raped, and she was obviously understandably in very dire straits, bloodied, bruised, and needed help, and they took her to a hospital. Thankfully she survived and it was all okay. But that's where the genesis of the film came from, is what happens, what is the treatment of rape victims. And we're going back to the late 70s here in America, so we're going back 40 years nearly. And it's one of those films that the rape is necessary to be shown in order to justify the revenge. But actually I can also see from the BBFC stance that actually the rape, it does glorify it, in that it shows the rape unrelenting, and it is brutal, and it is nasty. But then rape is brutal and nasty. You know, what is good about I Spit on Your Grave is the fact that it does show the rape, much like Irreversible. It puts the viewer there. It doesn't eroticize it, in my opinion. It doesn't show that it's pleasant or sexy or fun or exciting, which a lot of rape revenge films do. This one is quite cold and clinical. There's no background music. That the camera stays put for the entire rape, much as in Irreversible, and you, the viewer, are forced to endure it. Now, there'll be a small section of society who will watch that and get off on it. They will enjoy it. They will enjoy seeing a woman being violated, or a man for that matter. But generally speaking, for most people, that's the bit where they go, okay, this is horrific. Now I get why the film is showing it. Now, does that mean that the film should show it? Well, that's a whole different ball game. And I can see why the BBFC they've made a kind of a stance of saying, well, we'll allow so much of it, enough to depict what's happening and the brutality of it. But they've cut, I believe, a few brief shots of the more potentially eroticizing moments, I think is what they termed it as. And they have been cut from the current UK version. And it is understandable why, but it is still, I think, one of the better films that deals with rape and revenge compared to a lot of films.
And also, and you make an interesting point about what was it? It was a point about how the BBFC might view it as nasty and shocking, but it is supposed to be nasty and shocking. And I remember watching I think it was a mini documentary for the Wes Craven movie Scream, and essentially the MPAA's argument about why they should cut it was that the violence was too graphic and disturbing, and Wes's argument was that it's murder. It's supposed to be graphic and disturbing. So you can obviously see why some people might raise their reservations at having the film's, possibly the integrity of a film, being censored. But then again, that's I think that's one of our con options. So the second pro I want to talk about is that it can potentially provide an alternate, a censored version can potentially provide an alternate option for those not wanting to view unduly graphic material. And obviously this might depend on what film you're showing. But I think certainly a good example of this is Cannibal Holocaust. And I was actually speaking to a friend about it, and he had seen the film. He had seen the uncut version of the film inadvertently, and said that he would never want to watch the film again in that form.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that?
I mean, Cannibal Holocaust is a film that's it's very interesting. Obviously, it at the time it was made, 1979, 1980, so similar era to I Spit on Your Grave. It was a film that was made with, I mean, it is a horror film. It is absolutely, that's its primary intent, is to entertain and to horrify you. However, what is interesting about the film is it's very meta. It is a film that talks about itself. And what is beautiful about and unique about Cannibal Holocaust is, much like with Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, it's a film that is designed to horrify and shock you because that is what you bought the film for, or rented it, or paid to view it as. And then for people to go, oh, but that's too nasty, that's too disgusting, it's the hypocrisy of it. So we, the audience, are going, well, I want to watch a dirty, nasty horror film. I want to be shocked and horrified. And then people watch what they're shown, like Cannibal Holocaust, and go, oh, that's horrible. That's just revolting. So the hypocrisy of it is what makes it a beautiful film. And those who have seen the film will know that it is a film about art and censorship and cruelty, man's inhumanity to both animals and other human beings. And it is also a story about the white Western world and the way it treats foreigners or non-Caucasian invaders. And it is in its own weird way, it is a parallel of the birth of America as a country, how white Westerns arrived on the shores of what was to be America. They destroyed and killed the native Indians brutally and said, right, this is now our land. And that is exactly what happens in Cannibal Holocaust. You have a set of students from New York University, I believe. They go out to Peru, South America, arrive under the guise of making a documentary about local people. And what do? They go around abusing, manipulating, torturing, murdering, and crucifying them. And then the natives, the local people, decide, no, we're not having this. We're going to take revenge. And they do. And so there's a beautiful dual irony of what it is talking about. And at the same time, it is horrifically disturbing. But I think obviously the problem with Cannibal Holocaust is it features animal killing. And for pretty much everybody, even most horror fans, animal killing is a no-go area. Because obviously animals have no say in what they can or can't do, or what that happens to them. And that is the problem with Cannibal Holocaust, is that all the animal cruelty in it, and there is an extensive amount of it. If anybody has seen it, you will know all about it. The extensive amount makes it a very vicious and brutal and unrelenting film. And it is sadistic and cruel. It's not just, as in many of the cannibal films, where we see a snake chopped up, once. It's a quick, clean kill. It is unrelentingly graphic and brutal, and there is really no justification for it at all. And even the director, Ruggero Deodato, has said in his re-edited version that he said even now, 35, 40 years later, he can't justify why he did what he did at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was egged on by the producers. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, and of course the BBFC have still issued cuts to the film.
Yeah.
Roughly a 30
it's about 4 seconds
to the killing of a small mammal.
Yes.
And of course you will get many people arguing that that the damage was already done, but then again you also have the argument that it's to do with consistency, that once the BBFC permits a certain thing, it gives credence to similar, potentially nastier sequences of animal cruelty.
This is it.
Past.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
And obviously, there's a very interesting debate to be held there. But another example I would cite for animal cruelty is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which was cut for animal cruelty quite late on. I think it was only revealed around 40 years or so after the film was made.
Yeah,
that the director had used tripwires
to
deliberately trip horses over, and so obviously the BBFC said, no, you can't have that sequence in the film anymore. We have to cut it. And so obviously then you will get people arguing that that the BBFC cut the film after it was already released, so it was a bit pointless. So obviously, so you get some people arguing that the horse bolted after the fence was closed.
Yeah, I mean, Butch Cassidy is an interesting case in that that for many years the film has been uncut. It's always been either a PG or a 12, or maybe a double A back in the day when it was originally released, but it hasn't ever been cut. And then, as you said, about I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, the BBFC realised that there were horse trips that had been staged for the film, which are cruel. And it is the 1907 Animal Cinematograph Act, which prevents the depiction of animal cruelty in British film. That's why we have to cut it. It's a law. It's not something that the BBFC choose to do. They have to do it by law. It's just the law of the land. So there is no, they don't have any leeway in it. But it's an interesting case in that it was, for all these years, it's been uncut, and now they've realised or been told that actually horse trips were staged cruelly. They've now cut it. The irony is that if you buy the DVD version or on VHS, it is still uncut. If you get it on Blu-ray, it's cut. And this is in the UK. So it's a very silly decision in that normally what happens if a film is altered, the new version replaces previous versions, except on old media. So, like with Blu-ray, now we're obviously on to 4K. So if a 4K version comes out, it will be the cut version. But if we go back to the DVD version, which is still available quite easily in most shops, you can get it for a £5 uncut. It's a very interesting case where the uncut version still exists along the legally classified censored version.
Yeah, it is a very interesting case indeed. So let's move on to Pro 3, which is that the cutting process tends to be quite a lot easier than its counterpart in the USA, where obviously the director and the MPA might have a lot of back and forth between them, which is what reportedly happened when Ari Aster had to cut some material from his folk horror film Midsummer.
Yeah.
And obviously here it's a relatively straightforward process, because obviously in the UK you have an advice viewing stage. So what happened with I Spit on Your Grave recently, when it was submitted to the BBFC by Kaleidoscope Entertainment, was that it was submitted for an advice viewing, so the BBFC could watch it beforehand and say, no, that this bit isn't acceptable, you need to cut this and so on and so forth for an 18 rating. And so when the film was submitted for formal classification, it was given an 18 rating without any further changes made. So there is certainly an argument to be said for the BBFC retaining this cutting process, given that it's relatively straightforward. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Obviously, every nation around the globe has their own set of industry standards for when it comes to film censorship and film ratings. And anybody who's studied the subject well will know that, a film in one country can be given a very much lower rating than another country, and vice versa, it can be given a much higher rating. So, and often a lot of people will go, well, it was given a lower rating in this country, why don't we get the same rating? Well, as nice as that might be, the problem is that what happens in one country doesn't apply to us here in the UK. And the way that the BBFC and the MPA operate are very different. With the BBFC, you submit your film and they go, yes, it's fine, you'll get X rating, a PG or a 15 or whatever. And then you either agree or disagree. If you disagree, there may be negotiation to go, well, if we cut this or delete this swear word, can we get the slightly lower rating? And then the BBFC will go yes or no. And then you choose. You either have to cut it and get the lower rating, or you'll uncut but at a higher rating. So there's negotiation. With the MPA, it is very much they'll go, you submit your film, you go, I want the R rating or a PG-13, and then they go, well, we're not sure about that. It's a little bit potentially too powerful or might be too sexual, and they don't give any anything more than that. They won't tell you what to cut or where or advisory. They will just give very broad terms of it's too violent, it's too sexual, it's too powerful, it's too whatever. The BBFC will go, cut this frame, remove this sequence, delete these 3 seconds here, and you'll all be fine. It's it's nice and simple. And I think that's what makes the BBFC much better. And I think a lot of other international classification systems on their bodies, around the globe, they tend to operate similarly to the BBFC. They will go, yes, you can have this rating if you cut this sequence, or we'll delete this bit, and it's fine. Or they'll go, no, you leave your film as it is, but you'll get a much higher rating. But it's as a distributor, it is your choice. With the MPAA, you don't have that. So
so and one of the interesting things is that the BBFC often tends to help the distributor. Well, at least they used to back back when the BBFC was cutting quite a degree more films. So for instance, in I think in Cutthroat Island, they would provide very specific instructions on how to cut a particular sequence so that it would flow better.
That's right.
Which I would actually regard as being pretty helpful to the distributor, because obviously the distributor can then cut the film in a way that is it's satisfactory whilst also not damaging the flow of the film so much that it renders a certain sequence incomprehensible.
Absolutely. I mean, the BBFC's aim has always been to try and advise they want to pass all the films uncut, every film, if they can. That's their ideal solution. If they can pass it, they will. But obviously, for most films, they will pass them at the whatever rating you want. If you're going in with the latest, I don't know, Marvel Thor film and you want a 12A, the chances are you'll probably get it. Or the latest Bond film, you want it as a 12A, you'll probably get it. But those are the films where they're big studio films. But even if you're a small independent low budget film where you've made it on a shoestring, they will still try and help you with an advisory, with suggestions and ideas. So again, they want to help you get your film out, and so they will give very specific answers. If you go, what would I need to cut this, or we need to tone it down, they will go, edit this bit, tone this down, lower the music, or whatever, and they'll be really specific. The MPAA don't do that at all. Now, one could argue that the BBFC are sort of almost trying to be their own directors. They're trying to almost nurture filmmakers and almost control them. But I see it more as like editors of manuscripts of books. You submit James Herbert or Stephen King submit their latest novel to an editor, and the editor goes, delete this chapter because it's superfluous. Take this passage out here, remove this, change this character's name, and then yes, you've got a book that will sell. That is what the BBFC do. Whereas the MPAA go, well, it's a bit too long, folks, but go back, come back in 6 months' time or 3 months and give it another shot. And I think then you have the cases where films are resubmitted time and time and time again, sometimes 10, 12 times before they'll finally get a rating. And it's stupid doing it that way. But I also believe the difference is that the MPAA, I don't know how their charging works, whereas the BBFC charge a set amount of money per foot of film. So in America, I don't know what their system is.
Yeah, it's certainly, and one of the interesting things about just going a bit off topic here. One of the interesting things about the MPA system is how secretive it is.
Yes,
it's so notoriously secretive that a documentary was made about it, called "This Film is Not Yet Rated" or something like that.
Yes, it is. Yeah, this film is not yet rated. It's phenomenal. I would highly recommend it. You can get it on DVD very easy now, and anybody who's any interest in censorship should watch that film. The MPAA are very cloak and dagger, absolutely, and that's what makes them really bad.
Yeah, and it's what makes them. It's what makes the BBFC a comparatively more an easier to follow system. I mean, they've got a kids website. I mean,
that's it.
got a kids website so that children can read about this stuff. Although although I do see why they cut off at the they cut off describing things at the 15 level, because otherwise,
Yeah.
well, I guess
Again, it's aimed at children, but the fact that they try to be open about it and go, look, this it's actually more aimed at parents than kids and families. But the fact is that a parent can go on, look at a film, look for the details, and go, well, this is why we've given this film a PG, not a U. And these are reasons why that it's okay for an 8 or 9-year-old, but your 6 or 7-year-old, it might be a little bit edgy for them. But they will explicitly say why, and that's what makes it really helpful. So I think it's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on. I think we should move on to the con arguments now. So con argument number 1 is that most of the material cut by the BBFC is already readily available on the internet, or you can very easily purchase it somewhere else. So some would argue that printing cut films is a waste of time and resources when you can just buy the full uncut version on, I don't know, Putlocker or some other kind of obscure torrenting site or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, whatever rules we have in society for anything, there's always going to be somebody who goes, I don't believe the rule should apply to me, therefore I'm going to find a way around that system. So whatever it might be. I mean, the obvious example being like a car. A car, you can drive at, I think, 70 miles an hour on a motorway. You're not supposed to go faster than that. If you do, you'll get done by the police. Most cars will legally go up to 120, 130 miles an hour. Now, does that mean you should drive at 120 miles an hour down a motorway? Well, no. But there will be people who go, well, I don't care. And they do. They speed along a motorway at 100. And then they get caught and they get fined. And they wonder why. And they go, well, it was empty. There was no one about. It wasn't a danger. The problem is that the internet is a Pandora's box. The internet was designed for one purpose, to connect people and share resources and information. However, with what it has done, it is literally Pandora's box. We've opened it and it is now a free-for-all. And the fact you have things like torrenting and the dark web and even Amazon, where you can go on to Amazon in America, Amazon in Spain, Amazon in Germany, and you can import any version of a film from that country to your address in the UK, it does make the BBFC seem pointless. However, that doesn't mean to say that what the BBFC do isn't worthwhile or valid. In the same way as having a car, just because it can go 120 miles an hour doesn't mean it should. But then one could argue, well, why are all cars not limited to doing more than 80? So you cannot drive excessively. But that would be another argument for another day. As I say, it all comes down to rule breaking. People who want to break rules will find some way of doing it, no matter what the law or the society says. And there is the problem. You can't. There are always going to be people who are going to do that, and you can't find ways to stop it.
No, I mean, trying to control the internet is like saying you're trying to control lightning, pretty much. Yeah. There's no surefire way around.
It can't be done. That's the thing.
It's just not. If you're trying to set your heart on doing that, don't. It is a complete and utter waste of time. So I guess it sort of leads nicely into the next argument, would be that some people might argue that the BBFC is pandering to a very small minority of worried parents, you could say, and that the BBFC is contributing to a nanny state, which is a bit of a controversial term, but nonetheless an argument to be examined.
I don't like the term nanny state. I think it's one of those sort of Daily Mail-esque terms that right-wing media loves to use, that we're being lectured as to what we can and can't do. As we've just shown, we live, the whole of everything in our life is controlled. There are things we can do and there's things we can't. No one seems to complain about most of them. I mean, it's illegal to murder somebody. Do you find people, constantly saying, oh, I'm really annoyed that I can't go around murdering people? most people don't care about it, because for most people, they don't want to go out and murder someone or rape them or, or be a serial killer. It's not, generally speaking, something, that most people aspire to be. But there are still rules and laws that says if you commit murder, you're breaking the law and you'll go to prison or be prosecuted for it. Same as speeding, same as taking drugs. And that's the thing, the BBFC are a form of law. Now, what is interesting is that a lot of people rally against the BBFC's existence, saying we don't need them, it's the nanny state, they're elitist, they're telling me what I can and can't do. And that's not the point. The point is the fact that back in 1912, when they were created, it was a choice between them being independent and doing the classification or censoring, or the government of the day. Now, anybody who remembers the early 1990s will remember the David Alton bill, after the Child's Play 3 hysteria kicked off during the James Bulger murder. And there's the David Alton bill, which was, the intention was that anything over a 12 would be potentially restricted from home viewing, and you wouldn't be able to do it. You wouldn't be able to rent it or buy it if it carried anything higher than a 12, unless there's exceptional educational or informational justification. So something like Saving Private Ryan would be acceptable, even though it's 15, or Schindler's List, again, it's a 15, that would be acceptable. Platoon, yes, that would be allowed, because again, it's the Vietnam War, but there'd be a lot of horror films that would not be allowed, regardless of whether they're, 15s or whatever, because they didn't have educational value.
Yeah.
And imagine if that was the government of the day doing that, and they were telling you what you couldn't watch. If people knew about the films that, if most people knew about the films that the BBFC did pass, like a Serbian film, which is legally available in the UK, albeit with 4.5 minutes of cuts, if the average Daily Mail reader knew that, they would be in hysterics. They'd be going, what on earth is happening? It's the end of the world. And this is the thing that people don't realize. Most people aren't aware of a lot of the notorious horror films that, anti-censorship people talk about. They're not stocked in the local, Tesco's or whatever. They're not that big. It's only hardcore horror fans like, and anti-censorship fans and people who know about films that are aware of their existence. And they're the ones that get talked about. But most people, generally speaking, wouldn't have a clue about Cannibal Holocaust, a Serbian film, Irreversible, or whatever. And therefore, I think there's an argument to go saying that it's the nanny state telling you what you can and can't do is a little bit foolish, when we live in a country and a world where there are all manner of rules and regulations that telling us what we can and can't do.
Okay, so now we swiftly move on to, the third con argument. So I guess the final argument we should examine is that there might be a lack of that people might accuse the BBFC of lacking evidence for cutting films. So in a future episode we'll be discussing the influx of the BBFC cutting films for either suicide or attempted suicide. So we will be discussing films like The Invisible Man, The Conjuring 3, that kind of stuff. So what do you think about that argument?
I think it's difficult. As I said in an earlier question, we live in a world where there always are rules and laws to obey. With films, the problem is we do have the internet, which does allow you to watch anything. I mean, you can go on YouTube and find several of the banned films in full, uncut and uncensored that people have uploaded. That doesn't necessarily mean that because it's available freely and easily, that it should therefore mean that the BBFC should no longer do their job or not exist. I have trouble with the idea of there being no censorship at all, because by that argument, that would mean things like child pornography would also be allowed, which, as we discussed earlier in this podcast about the cutting of that Sister Street Fighter film. And I think there has to be a balance, which is what the BBFC argue, between freedom to watch what you want within limits and freedom to watch material that is within the acceptable rules of society. So that would be my argument, is that I think the BBFC try and do the best they can but they're in a position of trying to please all the people all of the time, which is just not possible. So we have to be grateful that the BBFC are nowhere near as censorial as they used to be 30 years ago in the James Furman era. And anybody who's looked at the BBFC latest annual report that came out a couple of days ago will have probably noticed that they've, apart from one film that was banned, pretty much every film was not cut or censored in any way. And if anything was edited, it was released uncut for home viewing. So the BBFC have become much more flexible and relaxed about things than the heady days of the video nasty era.
Absolutely. So I suppose this draws us on to some interesting questions that we must examine. So the first one I want to ask is, at what point will society draw the line and say, no, we can't allow any more? At what point will we say this is too much? Because it would be, because I mean, you might have people saying like 30 odd years ago that The Evil Dead was something that should never have been allowed, but 40 years after it was first released, it's now pretty freely available. It's even available on 4K now. So I suppose the argument is, where do we stop?
I think the answer to that question is that there's always going to be the need for some kind of censorship at some point in time, somewhere down the line. I don't think there'll ever be a time in history where film, certainly in Britain, where the BBFC will go, right, we don't need to exist anymore. Every film will just be rated and that will be it. I think there'll always be need for intervention of some kind. And if you look through the history of film censorship in general in the UK, there's always been incidents of something being banned, then being released, either to one degree or form of edited or altered, and then eventually, after enough time has passed and society has changed, it has been safe enough to release it uncut. So even things that are banned today, in another 20, 30 years, even within our lifetimes, we may find that by the time you and I are in our 70s, stuff that's banned today may end up being considered acceptable by the BBFC. However, there will then be more films coming in that, because society changes all the time, and I think that's what is good about the BBFC, that there is flexibility. They are open to allowing films that were previously banned to be released in a slightly less cut version, or even an uncut version, as has happened with Evil Dead. But unlike, say, in Australia, where although there isn't the OFLC, the Office for Film and Literature Classification in Australia, a film there can be banned at 1 minute, uncut the next, and then rebanned and re-edited, and it can keep happening. So you can buy a film uncut today. In 5 more years, they may decide, actually, no, we've changed our mind. We want to cut it. We don't think it's acceptable anymore. Whereas the BBFC, once a film is out and uncut, they don't go back on it, with very, 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 very few exceptions. And I think possibly one of the only ones that comes to mind is the film you mentioned earlier on, which is Butch Cassidy. But pretty much almost all instances, once the film is out, it is out forever. And the BBFC don't then backtrack on that decision. So in all honesty, I don't think there'll ever be a time when the BBFC doesn't exist. And I don't think there's ever going to be a time when the rules of censorship just become a free-for-all. We have a free-for-all on the internet. And if people want to, there is material out there that you can see that would never see the light of day by the BBFC or other agencies. And I think that's how it will be. There has to be flexibility. We cannot live in a society where everything is just carte blanche, because then you really do open a world into very dangerous freedoms, as we've seen in America. In America, everyone tends to say that America's great for films because they can release things uncut and uncensored and unrated. That is good in many cases, but then you also get the same argument of the issues of freedom of speech, where people can say the most abhorrent things and do the most abhorrent things, and there's nothing you can do about it because it breaks their First Amendment rights. And I don't think we would have that that would not be a rule that British people would tolerate. The idea that you could go out into the center of your local town and shout really offensive, racist or sexual things, and not be able to be punished for it. I think that would be a very sad day if we ever got to that stage. And yet you can do that in America, which is irony. And then you look at what's happening in American politics and American society with gun crime, gun culture, violence, the Roe v. Wade decision about abortions and pregnancy, and then you realize how bad things are over there. And that is what worries me, is people who want complete freedom don't realize that complete freedom means the ability to do anything and everything. And we've all played computer games and watched films where it's a post-apocalyptic scenario where it is a free-for-all and you have to survive. I don't think that's a good system for our country to be in, personally. But that's just my opinion, and I know plenty of other people disagree with me vehemently on that.
Yeah, of course. And another question we should ask is that it regards the authority of the BBFC. So the question is, should we see the BBFC as trustworthy an organisation as we see as the majority of people in the UK see the police? Obviously, there's a lot of debate around the police at the minute as being institutionally racist or it being inherently sexist. But generally, there is an argument to be made that the BBFC should be seen as authoritative an organisation as the police.
I think you are right for the most part. I mean, the BBFC is much like any other organisation that oversees rules and rule breaking, like the police, like a local council, or anything else. There are a body of people who are just trying to do the best they can with the rules and limitations that they have. Now, the BBFC do have their own rules and regulations that are laws. And so there are things that are banned or cut in the UK because by law, they have no choice. Animal cruelty being one, child pornography being another, and certain extreme sexual violence and extreme pornography is also banned and cut in the UK. And I think that is the limitations. And so they're doing the best that they can in a situation where they're trying to please everybody all the time, and that's just not feasible, which I know I said earlier, so apologies to your listeners for repeating myself.
No worries.
But it's one of those things where, you know, you ask 10 different people, how would you censor or not censor a film? You'll get 10 different responses. And that's the thing, the BBFC do lots of focus groups around the country with different audiences, and I've been to a couple over the years, and I've seen uncut sequences and then cut sequences after, and sometimes it's hard not to disagree with the BBFC. You can see why they've done what they've done, because in the greater scheme of things, that is necessary.
Yeah. I mean, if you put an activity in front of with some kids or something and gave them a film like, I don't know, Star Wars and something, and said to them, how would you alter this for a PG rating or something like that?
Yeah,
you would get very different responses.
It
is something that tries to accommodate every single group, and like you said, it can be argued that it is an unrealistic proposition as such.
Yeah, I mean, the BBFC are in a no-win situation. Whatever they do, there's going to be somebody complaining. If they cut something, people complain they want to see it uncut. If they cut something, people say you should have cut more. If they rate it a 15, people say it should have been 18. If you give it a 12, it should have been a U. They just cannot win whatever they do. So imagine, you know, the amount of flack they get and the hassles they get. You kind of wonder why they do the job they do. It's a job in which they can never win. And if you were in that position of trying to do a job, your job, not something you've necessarily chosen to do or want to do, but you have to, like the police do, you can see why people get wound up, and you can see why they as an organization would go, look, this is the rules. This is the rules we have to abide by. This is what it is. You know, there are some things we can pass. There are some things we can't. There are things we can do at certain levels, you know, a PG or a 12, but not at a U. Or something we'd allow a 15 and 18, but we can't do it in a 12A. And so when you're in that kind of position, you're kind of screwed. Pardon my French.
Yeah.
You know, there is really, what do you do?
Yeah.
All you can do is just the best. Yeah.
I love the fact that that's like the only swear word we've used, and it's still a pretty tame one. So we rate this podcast podcast. But yeah, that's so I hope this podcast has been informative as to the debate around censorship and the pros and cons of it. Thank you very much, John, for your insightful opinions.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
No worries, absolutely. I will see you for episode 5, where we will be discussing contemporary BBFC issues. So for now, it's goodbye.